Okay, hi there. Here we are back with scope management knowledge area, and we're going to complete our discussion of that with the last two processes there, which are 5.5 validate scope and 5.6 control scope. By all rights, before we do validate scope, in the scheme of things, we would be doing our project schedule first and costing and all that, and then build our deliverables. And then, as we saw in the life cycle of a deliverable earlier, we would then put it out through quality control, which we haven't addressed yet in detail, and then into validate scope at that point. But I think it's best if we just complete this knowledge area in its entirety now, not to break it up. It may make more sense to you anyway. So here we go with validation and control of the project scope. There it is, 5.5. Here's our knowledge area overview. So now in a little more detail, here's our ETO diagram. Why are we validating scope? Well, as you might recall from our little scenario of following the life cycle of a deliverable itself through all the processes, we need to seek customer deliverables acceptance eventually in the end, or we want to open change requests to make corrections to scope because we just didn't, we built something they didn't want or we built it wrong, and then we want to convey status to stakeholders. That's validate scope right there. Okay, so here's our data flow diagram for process 5.5 validate scope. Notice here that in bold here, which is not the actual printed PMBOK text, because I have in my possession the first printing of the PMBOK. There were some errata there, and one of them was they called this over here a validated deliverable that was not correct, and they corrected it in their errata. So if you have in your hand a version or the second printing of the PMBOK, you'll have the correct word in their verified deliverables. So given that, let's talk about this data flow diagram. What do we have coming in here to help us validate scope? Well, we have our requirements document, our retraceability matrix. We'll need all that to make sure that, as additional evidence and validation that the scope is really the scope, okay? And we have from quality control, you might remember that once the deliverable is produced, it goes into quality control so that they can look at the metrics, quality metrics, to make sure it's within all the metrics that are required, and then it is output down here as a verified deliverable into validate scope. Now once we do validate the scope, that item deliverable is now promoted and output as an accepted deliverable. So again, you need to be sure you understand the differences between deliverable, verified deliverable, accepted deliverable. And likewise with change requests over here, change requests always go into 4.5, but they'll come out as approved change requests, and then eventually they'll end up as validated changes. So you got to get these terms right so you're not tricked on an exam. So other input, here's 4.3, that's where we're building or executing the work that's required by the scope baseline by the work breakdown structure, and then certain information comes out into monitor control so they can make their proper adjustments, maybe do some change controls. And here's change requests directly from validate scope that we may find because it did not meet the scope requirements. We need to make adjustments, corrective actions, or defect repair even, goes into perform change. Now, but the primary thing we're doing with validate scope is looking at, the work breakdown structure. So where is that as an input here? You don't see it, do you? The reason is, and this is a PMBOK, that's the way they do things here. If it is part of the project management plan, they do not necessarily be very concise and say it. So over here, project management plan, this is where the scope breakdown is. It's in there. See, the scope baseline is your scope statement, your official scope statement. WBS dictionary, that is part of the project management plan here. It's not a project document, part of the project management plan. So it comes in down there into validate scope out of work breakdown structure. Now here it's specific. This is 5.4 that we just did in the prior module. We produced the scope baseline, which includes those three items, and it goes into validate scope as an input. But now when you look at this diagram, the input is project management plan. So you'll see this convention by PMBOK a number of times in these diagrams. So don't get thrown like, where is it? And if you get a quiz question or exam question about these kind of things, you need to know that they're saying because the project management plan comes in and other subsidiary plans will help validate scope, it does not specifically call out the scope baseline. So even though the scope baseline was a direct output specifically of 5.4, when you input it here, it's from, you're building the work now in 4.2, that's where you execute and build the work according to the work breakdown structure. It comes in under the umbrella of the project management plan. So that is really where your scope baseline comes in, and that's what you're validating against. The things coming in from collect requirements up there, requirements doc and their traceability matrix, are subsidiary, helpful documents, references, just to make sure things are in sync and something didn't get out of whack. Maybe you forgot to, update your documents when something changed. It's a good cross-check, but the main document is the scope baseline that comes in that you're going to validate against, and that's under the the project management plan. Kind of tricky maybe, but now that you understand this, some of these diagrams may make a little more sense to you because of that. So again, let's just go back again, because this is so critically important that we understand in the normal day-to-day work of creating and approving and delivering deliverables, how this really works under the PMBOK methodology. Here again, up at the top, it says project integration management. So here's the knowledge area for that. It's in parentheses just to show that we've seen this before, but let's look at it one more time. Over there on the right, you have your deliverables output from your direct and managed project work. Again, that's an executing process group. That's where you build these deliverables according to the project management plan that comes in as an input there. Your scope baseline is there. That's why you're building this stuff and how you're building it. And it goes out and eventually comes in down into closing as the final product. Now, kind of the philosophy here, and this is real world stuff. I mentioned way early, way in the beginning of this series, of why quality management is overlooked many times by project managers. They don't consider it important enough or whatever, but here is the reason why that is a very bad thing. So here's your deliverable. You want to give it to your client in close, right? What if you gave the raw deliverable that was just produced, no quality control, no requirements, scope validation, and you just gave it to your client? Okay, you are saying, we think we built this right, Mr. Client, and we think it's what the customer wanted. Okay, some black box process, whatever that is, says, yes, you built it right, and it's just what we expected it to be. Great. Now it goes into final product. That's what you want. But what if you don't have it built properly? Now it says, sorry, you built it poorly, and it's not what we expected. Now it goes into perform change control as a change request to fix it. Okay, or fix your scope, or trash it if it's really not what you want. But this is bad. It doesn't get to the final product because you built it poorly, it didn't meet quality requirements, or it was not within the scope that was approved. A very bad thing. Now, there are ways around that, which we should know by now, but let's look at that in a minute. Okay, refresher, here we have the scenario where one of the team members built a deliverable according to the work breakdown structure, and either they didn't have in place or they avoided certain quality processes that are in place to avoid what's going to happen here. But they deliver it, try to deliver it to the client, and the client says, great, you didn't build it properly, quality suffered, look at it, and besides, it's not what I expected it to be in the first place, so rejected. Okay, so now all that is wasted time and money. Your project schedule may suffer, your cost may suffer, your image with the client's going to suffer, so you need to avoid that. And just, how are we going to do that? Well, we need an element of monitoring and controlling to monitor and control that deliverable before it ever gets to the client. So again, here I've superimposed the various process groups that these processes fall in, as we saw way earlier. So we do have monitoring and controlling here in integration management, but that in itself has nothing directly to do with taking your deliverable out of 4.3 and getting it processed properly for the client. So what we want is this monitoring and controlling up here to have some processes in this black box that would allow us to finally go from deliverables right to the client. Now, we've seen this before, but let's just look at it again, make sure we understand. We have quality control. We have 8.3 that looks at it from the metric standpoint, make sure it's built properly and within specifications and all that. And then it goes through scope control and says, yes, that is what they wanted, and then you deliver it. So here's a scenario that we may happen too. We think we build it right. We think that's what the client wanted. It goes into quality control, goes into scope control, and says, again, sorry, we didn't do it, but at least there's a reason for it now. So up here, here's quality control again. Quality management plan is what produced your quality metrics that you're using up here to compare to the raw deliverable that comes in here. And here's your scope baseline up here under the guise of the project management plan. We just talked about that earlier. You go through your tools and techniques, you build the deliverable up here, and you go some tools techniques where you apply the metrics and you decide, okay, it's verified. Then it comes out, goes into scope baseline, and these are all monitoring and controlling that we didn't have if we just gave it directly to the client to begin with. Comes in here, verified deliverable, you check it against your scope baseline with the client, says, yeah, that's good, accepted deliverable, and now you give it to the client, and finally, and into the production environment. So the key is you need to have this external monitoring and control. So even if it's in place and you avoid it, that's bad. See, if it's in place, and it should be in place, you can avoid all those problems. By the way, change requests, again, All these red change requests are outputs. So you can see again, not only these three knowledge areas of quality, scope, and integration management issue change requests. Others do too. But all of them go one place. Keep it in mind, don't fail an exam question because you don't remember this. All change controls go to one place only, 4.5 right there. They come as an input into perform integrated change control. Then those change requests are massaged through your change control board, and if they are approved change requests, they go to multiple places, in particular up into manage and direct your work, where you're building your delivery, where you make your adjustments according to the approved changes, and they also go into quality up here so that they can check that against the deliverable you're going to give them eventually. Then we follow it through again, everything looks fine, doing that. And this is a real messy diagram, but what this shows, this was both what we just saw, the deliverable going through and all the change requests. It just shows the complexity and all the interactions and iterative stuff that goes on through all these things. These are living processes, and you can see how dynamic this stuff is. That's why when you focus on one thing, it's a lot easier than trying to see the whole picture at once. But this stuff could be very complex, but this is how it happens in the world. So keep that in mind, and you don't want that scenario where you take a raw deliverable and just deliver it to the client without your quality processes, reviewing it, and without making sure that it's actually what the client wanted. So very important. So here's validate scope down here, our process. So 8.3, that's quality. You need to be starting to remember what these numbers mean. 8 is quality. 4 is your integration management. So your verified deliverables come in here, accepted deliverables and necessary change requests come out down there. Here it is in the different view, the ITO view, same thing. Here's our data flow for it. Validate scope, we saw this a little earlier, but again, validated deliverables come in, accepted deliverables out, change requests go over there. The basic validation references that we use during this scope validation process are all the project management plan components, in particular the scope baseline, which is the project management plan component. That's why in the diagram it shows PM plan coming in, not specifically the scope baseline, because there's more to it than that. And again, your requirements document here, your traceability matrix are all used to help you validate and confirm that yes, this is the specific deliverable that exactly is what the client wanted. Verified deliverables come in to do that. Work execution artifacts. Okay, verified deliverables come in from quality management, 8.3, and also raw data comes in from executing the project, which you can use also to help you validate these things. Tools and techniques, primarily, as we saw when we talked earlier about this, inspection is the primary tool you use to look at the work, look at the coding, look at the product, look at whatever it is that you're trying to produce at that point that is trying to be delivered. And you inspect it. You may need to do group consensus, decision-making things, that, make sure everybody's in agreement that, yes, let's now turn this over to the client. So, and again, it could be intangible or tangible product or service or result. Whatever it is, you got to make sure that's exactly what is in your scope baseline. If not, you need to make adjustments, which you don't really want to make at this point in the game. Your inspection methods, by the way, physical examination, if it's a tangible product, you pick it up, look at it. You may need to audit things like, or walkthroughs, like code walkthroughs, functionality audits, whatever it might be to inspect it. Group consensus, again, you get your voting, your plurality, your dictatorship might just be, no, you give it to them. Whatever's appropriate in your project, you got to be good with. So you have your tools, and finally, output is an accepted deliverable. It's past quality, it's past scope baseline validation, and now it's accepted deliverable. The customer has agreed or approved, because you're with them, and say, okay, here it is, can we turn this over to you officially during our closing process? You'll say, yes, that's good. And this is an input then to your close project, or if it's a phased project, still you still do it during your close processes. Accepted deliverable. Now, if things go wrong, change requests are, of course, appropriate. If the deliverable is not approved, you issue change requests. It goes back into perform change control. You make your corrective action. The downside there is it's going to cost you some penalties in time and rework costs. And again, your image with the client. You don't want to lose confidence, have them lose confidence in your ability to manage this project according to the scope baseline. Now, if we find, that the scope baseline is wrong, well, there are reasons for that. Either you didn't do good in collecting requirements, or they didn't do a good job in conveying to you what they wanted. So then you get into some conflict resolution, perhaps, when you may have to argue about who's right. But in the end, still, they didn't get what they wanted or expected. So you got to make corrective actions and just deal with the consequences and try to keep the rest of the project, if there is more, back in line. Work performance information, it's your raw data. You communicate this to stakeholders as they may need to know some of these things from your processes. and your project document updates, product definitions, status reports are specifically called out in the PMBOK as possible documents you may want to update because you are validating your scope. Now, the last process in scope management is controlling the scope, because now you have a scope baseline. You need to control that and try to avoid change if possible, but change is inevitable. So let's see what we can do. Control scope. Here's your ETOs. Basically, work performance data comes in because you're building the work. These are the statistics that are necessary for you to be able to evaluate how it's going as you're building your work. You look at variance analysis, one tool and technique, variance analysis. And the outputs of that, the products of doing that, are work performance information and maybe corrective or preventative actions and change requests. See, so that's what that is. Now, by the way, variance analysis, like I mentioned, it's the single tool that you need to use to control your scope. Are you varying from it? If you are, change request to get it back in line. And we'll talk about some of the neat stuff in this data flow diagram in a minute. Okay, so here's our data flow diagram for the control scope process. I've shown in blue here just again to reinforce the importance of you knowing which process group these processes are in. Let's just review that here once again. The two on the left and right with the arrows, you know what process group they are. Develop the plan and develop the plan. They're both the same. What group? Well, planning, because it's a plan, so that's the planning. Down here, lower left with the arrow, direct and manage the project work. What happens in that process? You should know that by now. That's where you direct and manage and build the deliverables. And what process group is that? Are you planning? No, you've already planned. Are you monitoring what's happening? Well, no, you're executing the work, so that's an executing process. These two over here with the blue, it's kind of obvious from the title here, but you're monitoring and controlling the work and performing change control. Although if I asked you what process group is performing integrated change control in, you still should know that it's monitoring and controlling. So you need to know these things. You never know what kind of questions will be on the PMP exam. They may be relatively easy questions, and they will be if you just know what process group these processes are in. So you need to study this, study the table 3.1 matrix so that you're dead sure where these things fall. You will miss a number of questions on the exam if you're not sure about these things, so make sure that you are. I've circled work performance data comes in from performing the work. That's just raw data that the project manager and the team needs to know, so they know how these people are doing things, because they can't be watching them 100% of the time, so they need data. And then they get that, and if they may need to control how things are working out based on that data, and then they'll compile that, prepare work performance information out of it and feed that back into them, into monitor and control, so that you can deal with that information and make the proper corrective actions. And of course, the main output, if needed, is change requests in the perform to make corrective or preventative actions or other things. PM plan, what is it? Obviously, the main one here, because we're talking scope control, is your scope baseline, which is what? It's your scope statement, your WBS, and your WBS dictionary. Those three are the scope baseline. Of course, the scope management plan is how you're going to help do these things. Your change plans, so you do your change requests properly and consistently. Configuration management plan, if you need to update documentation, which you will, your project documents, or your PM plan, you got to version control them properly, so that's your configuration management plan, help you do that. And your requirements management plan is how are you going to manage your requirements, how are you going to manage changes to the scope baseline, changes to the requirements documentation. That's all in there. And here's, speaking of that, here's your requirements documentation. They come in as inputs, and these are how the requirements are meeting the business need. Okay, you got to have that linkage to the business all the time. Business alignment, their objectives, your stakeholder, how they impact things with their requirements, the solution to requirements, functional, non-functional. Again, the requirements doc is a level before. It's a more broadly framed requirements document than your actual scope statement. So, solution, basic solution. I think we can solve these requirements and this deliver by doing this. Everything that helps you build finally your work breakdown structure. For the project itself, what's your acceptance criteria for things, how are you going to turn over to the client once that you finally do get a good product. It says, close, final product. Well, there are probably some formalities involved. You get official sign off, which you may need in order to get paid, for something. So, that'd all be in the requirements doc. And of course, your assumptions, dependencies, constraints are in there that hopefully you deal with in your scope statement. And over time, you want to convert your assumptions to actual concrete criteria that you can deal with precisely. Your traceability matrix comes in. This is what links the product from its origin to the requirements. to the deliverables that satisfy them, and finally to the business objectives. That's the main reason for your traceability matrix. Work performance data comes in, all these kinds of things, many kinds of things. I mean, this is a very short list, but for example, numbers of change requests approved, rejected, under review, the number of deliverables completed, just raw data that you're going to massage and turn into actionable, reasonable information that you may want to then report to your stakeholders according to your stakeholder and communication management plan. So here's your organizational process assets coming in to help you control scope, formal and informal, scope control policies, procedures, monitoring and reporting methods, templates, whatever's available to help you do these things when you control scope. Again, here we go, only one process in controlling scope, variance analysis. And why? Have we gone out of bounds from the scope baseline, basically? So it's the scope baseline versus the as-built deliverable that was built properly, but is it really what you want, what the client wanted? So that's the basis. Variance, if it varies, is the basis for corrective or preventative action. So project scope management. We didn't do this up front, we'll do it now. What is it? It's all about ensuring that the project includes all the work, only the work, and with a major emphasis on what should not be included in the project scope. Scope management. So you're going to have some outputs. Performance information goes back into monitor controlling the work. Project scope performance information goes in there so that you can eventually, work with the people doing the work to help them get back on track. The types of change requests that are received. This is Latin here for received. Identify scope variances and the reasons for them. You may have a problem, but why? Even if you got to put, some process, you got to cite a process or whatever it is. Why did this happen? And that is why you do over here change requests to correct that problem and then be able to prevent it later. Why wouldn't you classify it as a preventative change? Well, because it's already happened, so now you got to correct it. If you see stuff trending here, you may then do a preventative so it does not get out of control eventually. So that's a difference between those two. Work performance information shows the variance impact on this cost and schedule, because you'll have some impact on it, on your triple constraint. Future scope performance forecasts you can do because you're getting the raw data turning in information. Now you can start trending things, would be good. And all this is the basis for future scope decisions that you may need to make. So that's some of the outputs is this performance information. And again, you need to look on the data flow diagram if you are unclear where the performance data information output, where it goes to, what input. So you need to keep referring to that so you understand where these things go. By the way, on the PMP exam again, there will be questions quizzing your knowledge of where do outputs go to, where are the inputs to, and where are outputs inputs to, and inputs where are the outputs. You're going to be quizzed on these things. You need to know as best you can the relationships of the major inputs and outputs. Not to say you don't know the tools and techniques, you need to know those too, but certainly you're going to be quizzed on a number of things to make sure you understand which processes take what inputs and outputs and et cetera. So you need to keep looking at that, keep looking at table 3.1, keep looking at the data flow diagrams, these inputs, outputs, understand them. And the better you understand them, the much better success you'll have at passing your exam. And besides that, you'll have a much better chance of doing a better job in project management if you are able to actually adopt some of these processes and concepts in your own work. Would be great. Change request is an output again. You may need now to change your baseline because scope, I didn't want that. It's wrong. Why did you do that? Okay, well, money now is down the tube and everything else, so you may need to change your scope baseline if in fact, maybe you did build something wrong, meaning not in the scope baseline, but maybe you're lucky. And the client says, hey, okay, I see why you did that. You shouldn't have done it without approval, but I'll take that. Good, you're lucky. But then you still need to change your baseline to include it in there. Never accept anything that's not in the baseline. So maybe you're lucky and they'll say, okay, regardless, I'll take it, update your scope baseline. And at that point, you would not impact cost or time or schedule because it's already done, and luckily they said, okay, that's good, just change your baseline and be done with it. Change request, preventative correction, defect repair would be there. Enhancement request, here's another here's where the enhancement of the 5, here's the instance of enhancement requests come in here. If you look at PMBOK in the detail, which you should always do, always read this to accompany this series word for word so you understand what we're talking about. And you'll see in here enhancement requests under this process, 5.6. And then, of course, as you should know by now, I hope, all change requests go one and only place, 4.5, integrated change control. Outputs, PM plan updates, your scope baseline may need to be updated for good or bad. Other baseline, maybe cost, maybe your schedule needs to change too. So baseline updates are a natural output if needed from control scope. Project document updates, your requirements document up there to get it back in sync with your scope baseline, and of course you need to sync up then with your traceability matrix if you need to. Organizational assets, the causes for variances, you want to document those, get them in your file. Corrective action that you chose to take to correct scope problems, get that in your file, and other lessons learned, of course, you want that in your file. So that's it for project scope management. A very critical process, very critical knowledge area, that is, with all of its processes. If you don't get this right as best you can at the onset, you're going to have problems downstream. You really want to avoid that. You've done a good job getting your team together and all that other stuff. Now don't mess it up here. Do the best job you can. Keep in constant contact with your stakeholders. Make sure everything's on track before you start building something actually and committing all that time and resource and money. So now the next thing we're going to talk about in our next module 14, we're now going to talk about risk, because now that we have the WBS, we can certainly now start talking about the risks involved with accomplishing that according to the baseline. Things that we got to watch out for, plans in place to avoid problems or plans to compensate for problems if they do occur. So we're going to talk about that in risk. Another knowledge area that a lot of project managers don't even consider, and when a problem comes up, they say, wow, what is that? What do I do? Well, you should know that beforehand. So we'll see you next time, module 14. We'll talk about risks, a really interesting knowledge area.